Okay, so confession right up front. I wrote an entire blog post about this exact verse that we're going to talk about today, probably like 8 years ago now, maybe even more. It was called something along the lines of finding God in the quiet. And if you have ever heard me tell you to turn off the noise and listen for the still small voice, that post is where it all started. Welcome to She's So Scripture, where we take the text seriously, take ourselves a little less seriously, and let Scripture form us instead of just inform us. I'm Diane, and I'm glad you're here, so let's get started. The still small voice. 1 Kings 19. You know this one whether you've read the chapter or not because it's floated free from its own context at this point. God isn't in the wind. God isn't in the earthquake. God isn't in the fire. And then the whisper. And for years, that's what I taught. God speaks softly, so hush up and listen. Turn off the noise. Quiet your heart, all of that. Which is a little funny for me to say out loud on a podcast. I totally get that irony. I've got the verse underlined in, well, probably more than one study Bible, but at least one, with a little swirl next to it. I don't know why. I was in my swirl era at the time. But I want to make it clear that I'm not walking any of that back exactly. The whisper is real. The Hebrew there is genuinely one of the strangest three-word combinations in the whole Tanakh. And we're going to get into it because it's beautiful, and translators have been arguing about it for probably 2,000 years. But somewhere in the last few years, I finally read the paragraph that comes after the whisper out loud, all the way through, which apparently I had never really done, probably read it, but didn't let it sink in. And that's the paragraph that changed how I read the whole chapter. So let's back up first because you know me, context is doing all the work here and most of us skim right by it. Elijah has just come off Mount Carmel, biggest day of his career, probably the biggest day of his life. Fire falls from heaven, the prophets of Baal are finished, rain comes after 3 straight years of drought, and the man outruns a chariot going down the mountain. He is operating at full capacity, adrenaline, vindication, the whole thing. And then Ahab gets home and tells his wife what happened. Jezebel sends a messenger. Verse 2. So let the gods do to me and worse, if by this time tomorrow I don't make your life like the life of one of them. Verse 3. Frightened, he got up and ran for his life. He runs to Beersheba, which is the southern edge of Judah, about as far as the Israelite imagination went. Then he leaves his servant there and keeps walking. One more day into the wilderness by himself, past the last human being on earth who knows where he is. And he sits down under a broom tree and asks God to kill him. It's too much, he says. Now, Adonai, take my life where I am no better than my father's. Now, I want to pause here and slow down because the text does. And like I said, most of us just blow right on past this. This is the man who called down fire from heaven. 48 hours later, he's under a shrub in the desert asking to die. And scripture doesn't editorialize about it at all. It doesn't say his faith failed. It doesn't say he should have known better. It doesn't say, well, this is what happens when you take your eyes off the Lord. That tends to be the things we're taught, right? It just tells us what happened. Frightened, ran, sat down, asked to die. Which honestly is one of the reasons I love this book. Now, here's the part I find almost unbearably tender every time. He falls asleep. An angel wakes him up and hands him food. Bread baked on hot stones, a jar of water. He eats and goes right back to sleep. Now, I don't know about you, but I can totally identify with this because, food and a nap always does the trick. Then the angel comes back a second time. Verse 7, get up and eat because the journey is too much for you. That's it. No lecture, no sermon about where he went wrong, no correction of any kind. Somebody just made sure he ate and let him sleep some more. Then Elijah walks 40 days and 40 nights all the way to Horeb, the mountain of God. 40 days and 40 nights. If that number rings a bell, it should. Moses was on that same mountain 40 days and 40 nights, twice. Horeb and Sinai are the same mountain, just going by two different names, which is not unusual. So a prophet running for his life ends up at the exact spot where the covenant was given. That's a very long walk in a very specific direction. And the writer of Kings hands us that number 40 on purpose. Now, here's a small thing in verse 9 that a lot of English translations just kind of don't emphasize. They kind of smooth it over, and the Tree of Life version does not. When he arrived there at the cave, not a cave. There's a definite article sitting there in the Hebrew, which is a little odd since presumably Horeb had more than one cave, and a lot of translators just drop it so nobody gets confused. But that definite article is doing all the work. Some scholars think that article is pointing back to Exodus 33, where God tells Moses to stand in a cleft of the rock, covers him with his hand, and passes by. Now, I want to be very careful here because this is a reading, not a proof. The text doesn't come out and say the cleft where Moses stood, but the article's there. And 2 verses later, God tells Elijah to come out and stand on the mountain, and we're told the Lord is passing by. Same mountain, same posture, same verb. I'm not going to tell you it's certain. I'll tell you the writer of Kings clearly knew Exodus 33 inside and out, and I don't think that pattern showed up by accident. Okay, so the whisper. Verses 11 and 12, and I'm reading the whole thing because the rhythm of it makes a difference. Behold, Adonai was passing by. A great and mighty wind was tearing at the mountains and shattering cliffs before Adonai. But Adonai was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake. But Adonai was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire. But Adonai was not in the fire. After the fire, there was a soft whisper of a voice. A soft whisper of a voice. In Hebrew, that's kol, demamah, dakah. 3 words. Nobody really agrees on what to do with them. Kol is the easy one. It's voice or sound. 2 verses later, a voice speaks to Elijah, same word. So whatever this is, the narrator's perfectly comfortable calling it a voice. Demamah comes from a root that means to be silent or to be still or to stop. It's the word for what the sea does when God calms a storm down. Hush. Dakah comes from a root that means to crush something, to beat it fine, like thin and powdery. It's the kind of word you'd use for manna on the ground, the flaky stuff. Put them together and you get something like a voice made out of crushed silence, a sound made of thinness, which is not a phrase English particularly wants to produce, if I'm honest. That's why the King James went with still small voice, and the NRSV went with sheer silence, which basically leaves the paradox sitting there for you to deal with yourself. And the NIV kind of just brought it down to gentle whisper. The TLV settles on a soft whisper of a voice. That's the one I like best, actually. It keeps the sound and the softness at the same time without pretending the tension isn't there. Here's my own take on it, and I flag it as mine because it is. Hebrew has ordinary words for quiet. It has ordinary words for whisper. The writer used none of them. He built something that just doesn't resolve cleanly, and I think it's deliberate. I think whatever Elijah heard out there, the narrator couldn't quite name it. So instead of forcing it into some tidy phrase, he handed us 3 words that grind against each other. Elijah wraps his face in his mantle before he goes out to the mountain. Moses hid his face at the bush. Prophets who sense what's coming, it seems, cover their eyes. Now, here's the part that I skimmed over for years, genuinely skipped every single time I taught this. God asks Elijah the same question twice. Once in verse 9, before the wind and the earthquake and the fire. Once in verse 13, right after the whisper. Same question, word for word. What are you doing here, Elijah? And both times, he gives the exact same answer. Verse 10 and verse 14. He's been zealous for Adonai Tsevaot. The people forsook the covenant, tore down the altars, killed the prophets. And then this. And I alone am left. He says it before the mountain does its thing, and he says it after. The wind didn't move him. The earthquake didn't move him. The fire didn't move him. And notably, the whisper didn't move him either. Whatever happened up there, it didn't change a single word of what Elijah believed about his own situation. So God switches approach entirely. And there's no comfort in what comes next either, if we're being completely honest. No, I know you're exhausted. No gentle correction of his feelings. Verse 15, God just says, go back. Return the way you came. And he hands him a job. Anoint Hazael king over Aram. Anoint Jehu king over Israel. Anoint Elisha son of Shaphat as prophet in your place. In your place. People read that line 2 completely different ways, and honestly, both are defensible. Some read it as mercy. A burnt-out prophet gets relieved of duty and gets to pass the mantle to someone younger. Hey, retirement's on the way. Others read it as a rebuke, sort of. A man asks God to end his life, and God more or less grants the request, just in a different key. The text doesn't settle it for us. And I want you to start leaning into times when the text doesn't settle for us. Not avoid it, not try to fill in the blank. Let it settle. Now, I lean toward mercy mostly because of the bread and the water back in the wilderness and because of what God says just 3 verses later, but I hang on to that very loosely, and I would want you to hang on to it fairly loosely as well, because verse 18 is where God actually answers the complaint. He says, yet I have preserved 7,000 in Israel, whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and whose mouth has not kissed him. Elijah said, I alone am left. He was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not sinfully wrong, but wrong the way exhausted people get wrong about the size of their own life. He'd been walking 40 days with nobody to talk to. And the story he was telling himself out there kept getting smaller and smaller until there was exactly one person left in it. 7,000. He never met a single one of them, didn't know their names, didn't know their towns, and every one of them had stayed faithful the entire time he was convinced he was the only one standing. Paul reaches for this exact passage in Romans 11 when he's making the case that God hasn't walked away from Israel. He goes and gets the 7,000, builds a whole argument about God's faithfulness on the back of one exhausted prophet under a bush who was wrong about how alone he was. So here's where I've kind of settled on it for now, at least. I haven't stopped loving verse 12. I still get a little bit of, the goose pimples when I read it, and I'd be lying if I said otherwise. But I stopped teaching it as a lesson about volume. God shows up in a hush at Horeb. God showed up in fire on Carmel 2 chapters earlier. Same God, same week. The chapter isn't ranking the delivery methods. It never was. What the chapter is actually doing is putting a man at the absolute end of himself on the mountain where the covenant started, feeding him twice, asking him one question twice, letting him give the same wrong answer twice, and then handing him a job and a number. 7,000 people he'd never met. I think about that more than I probably should, if I'm honest. Anytime I'm convinced I'm the only one who sees something, anytime I'm sure I'm doing something the hard way alone, it's usually not true. It's just quiet. And the bread came first, by the way. Before the mountain, before the whisper, before any of the correction, someone fed him twice and let him sleep, before a single word of explanation showed up. Now, I don't have a cute, neat little takeaway for that one. I just notice it every time I read this chapter. If you want to keep going on your own this week, read 1 Kings 18 straight through into 19 back to back so that you actually feel the whiplash between Carmel and the broom tree. Then set Exodus 33 next to 1 Kings 19 and watch what each man does with his face. Then go read Romans 11 and watch Paul put those 7,000 to work. I want to thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I truly appreciate your support. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform. This way you'll get updates as new episodes become available. And if you feel so inclined, please leave us a review and share the show with someone you know. Your feedback and your recommendations help us grow and reach more people with insights and teachings from a biblical perspective. Stay blessed, friends, and see you next time.